This is an IWP media production, brought to you by the Institute of World Politics, the independent graduate school empowering the next generation of national security, intelligence, and international affairs experts. Learn from top scholar practitioners and acquire invaluable skills to propel your career. To learn more, visit iwp.edu.
Welcome to part 3 of our series on Africa with the Institute of World Politics. We're joined by Professor Kepp and Dr. Snyder. We're going to jump right in. New actors on the continent, more diverse menu for African states to choose from with who they work with. Speaking of technological developments that are becoming more prolific on the continent, this is an interesting phenomenon regarding that China is not the only one out there selling technologies like smart cities and things of that nature anymore. There's competition. Do we think that might change Chinese behavior on the continent? Do we feel like that might change? Are there some residual players that might actually be pushed out of the continent, like Russia or other groups? How do you guys anticipate this plays out, if it can be anticipated at all?
It's a little bit hard to say because these new players are indeed so new. And exactly what their role is going to be and how that's going to develop in Africa is a little bit hard to predict. If I had to guess, I would say that the loser in terms of weapons, technology, and things like that would be more likely to be Europe than China. China still has an advantage on the cost side. They have the advantage of a continent-wide presence that they can leverage. So again, I would say I think if there are losers out of this in terms of weapon sales and things like that, it would probably be Europe.
Makes sense. And it's not just technological developments. It's not just weapon sales. There are other capabilities that African states turn to to outsource to. CT, for example, counterterrorism is something that they have seen a growing need to bring in other players to help them alleviate those issue sets. Russia has typically been that group that they turn to the most, the Wagner Group, now Africa Corps, but to limited effect. And do you think that limited effect will have any impact on their choices moving forward?
Yeah, I think Russia as a CT partner, I think it's safe to say they've been an almost complete failure. If you look at Russian presence in the Sahel, which is now really the main locus of terrorism in Africa, I don't see any reduction in the volume and lethality of terrorist attacks there. As a tool to preserve these autocratic coup-based regimes, Wagner, the Africa Corps, is they've done their job. But in terms of addressing the terrorist issue, they haven't been a success. I still think that, to be honest, the world power that has the most experience in the CT world, who understands the terrorism problem, how to deal with the networks, how to collect intelligence on them, how to preempt and stop terrorist plots and attacks, it's the United States. And we've developed and honed that capability out of necessity to a high degree of effectiveness since 9/11. It's just that in some countries in Africa, like the Sahel, they've chosen a different partner. Other countries like Kenya remain a very close ally and friend of the United States when it comes to terrorism and other issues.
Do you feel like the United States is capitalizing on that advantage as much as it could be?
I think we've done, from what I've seen, I think we've done pretty much everything we can. There are just some situations where if the host country doesn't want to cooperate, doesn't want our presence there, well, they are sovereign states and they can kick us out or choose other partners or take some other path. But I don't think that that is for any lack of trying by the United States to persuade these countries that they have a problem and that we can help them.
Do you think that the growing problem of terrorism on the African subcontinent is going to outpace our ability to handle it? Or, I mean, we're moving into a focus on great power competition, trying to kind of steer away from where the focus of the United States national security apparatus has been for quite some time now. But the problem is obviously not going away. Do you think that it's in the United States' interest to allow other countries that may not even be partners with the United States to come in and fill some of those gaps? Or is this something the United States still needs to leverage its advantage in?
I think we need to leverage our advantage. For one thing, although we haven't had, as you know, any major attacks in the homeland now for some years, we all know what history tells us. When there is a safe haven where these groups can gather, train, conceive, and plot attacks against external powers, that is a risk, and that will happen. And you still see a good deal of this ungoverned space in Africa, places like Somalia, in the Sahel, Libya, and we have to be sensitive to that. It's not just threats to the United States, it's threats to our allies, Europe, for example, and our allies in Africa. Kenya remains subject to a great deal of threats and pressure from the unstable situation in Somalia. And we have an interest in helping protect them too. So I don't think it's something we should turn away from, even as we expand our interest to great power competition, economic affairs, and so forth. But terrorism will still be there on the menu, and it's something I would say the United States is, it's not much of an exaggeration, I would say uniquely positioned to help African countries address.
Do you think that there are other areas where we have that advantages that are growing? For example, there's been a lot of interest by African states on border security. Ghana, for example, as these coups have pressed against their gates and, terrorists come in from the Middle East. They go either through Khartoum or down through Libya, and they press against Ghana's borders. Yeah, border security becomes one of these areas that now that we have, I think, proven to the world that the United States knows how to control its border. But this is something that we could export as well.
Yeah, and I think I don't think there's anything new to that. I think as part of our global, worldwide effort to help other countries address insecurity and the problems that come from terrorism, border security has been part of that from the very beginning. So if a country shows a desire to partner with the United States on something like that, we have the capacity and the knowledge and the experience to help them with that. And Ghana would be a great example because you do see that pressure coming down from the Sahel on these West African states.
Any thoughts, Dr. Snyder?
No, I agree with Paul. I think that it's a place where we have the sales advantage, if you will, and we'll continue to have the advantage, particularly in the English-speaking countries. I think the French still in the deuxième service and others, where they're still allowed to play in Francophone Africa, probably have a slight advantage in terms of language and relationships. But technical abilities, I think we stand out and the Africans know it. So I don't see that changing. The Russians have proved they're really not good at it. And I don't know that the Chinese have been forced into demonstrating one way or the other. So they're kind of an X factor for me. Could they get into it in a big way? It's possible. If some of their people and facilities were threatened more directly by a terrorist group. But we haven't seen a reaction yet, for instance, because of the Somalis, where they're busy up in the same area we are, around Kenya and along the Kenyan coast. So I don't, they're an X factor for me. But otherwise, I agree with middle ones. Yeah.
Maybe this is a good time to kind of turn our attention towards Sudan as one of those areas that is, again, in the news, has been, unfortunately, for the last few years. As part of the development that has exacerbated, I think, obviously isn't the root cause of all growth of terrorism in Africa, but as the gateway, Khartoum being commonly known as the gateway between the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, having some fluidity there and who's in charge of Khartoum is surely an influence. Snyder, you obviously spent a good amount of time in Sudan. Now South Sudan, again, one of these areas we're rumored to be removing an embassy from, especially as there's been some escalatory developments in South Sudan we can talk about as well. What is your assessment of possibly how the United States should be involved with maybe even resolving the Sudanese crisis, or at least managing it in some capacity?
Well, I think because of our own history in the area, we have some claim on it in the sense that a lot of people look to us to be not necessarily the big dog, but certainly a lead dog in the process. And I think we've tried, but the leverage isn't there in Sudan. Both sides, in the case of Sudan proper, have outside allies on different sides of the fence. The odd part is both of the allies are allies of ours. So we do have some influence on that if we choose, but I just don't see the situation clarifying itself enough for us to make a big difference. And so we're keeping an oar in the water so we know what's going on. But like, for instance, right now, if you had to make a bet right now, you'd think that the army is restoring itself. But the problem is that ethnically and for other reasons, the Darfur piece of the equation is in the hands of Hermeti and his associates. And they're funded from the outside. They're weaponized from the outside. Both of them are. And thanks to the empty space that most of that area is, you're willing to fly stuff in. You can fly stuff in and give it to them without having to pass anybody's border officially, even though it's a well inland. It's the same kind of problem you have with many of the other guerrilla groups. Let's say 20 years ago, it was such an uncontrolled airspace that you could literally fly in unknown and jump off large supply of weapons, people, even if you wanted. And so that problem for the Africans writ large is there. And in Sudan in particular, it's such a big space that it's easy to get away with that. And then you've got porous borders as well. Yeah. Clearly, South Sudan doesn't control its home border, never mind internally. And then the other frontier areas, with the exception probably of Egypt, are kind of wide open. And even Egypt, do they care that much? They do, but they've got other fish to fry elsewhere.
Sure. Do you think that Sudan merits greater U.S. attention? It's become fairly international conflict with some international spillover. You have Ukrainians who are fighting Russians in Khartoum. You have the Russians who have fought both for first for the RSF to get access to gold, but now for the army in order to potentially re-engage for a naval base in the Red Sea. You've got the Chinese who have been involved to a limited degree. I think it was that they had offered to be mediators in the conflict. The Kenyans now, who are another American ally who potentially are hosting an exiled Hameti government, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of the people that the United States has a vital strategic interest in paying attention to are all centered around this area. Do you think that merits greater U.S. attention or a more aggressive U.S. response?
I think it doesn't necessarily merit more attention than it gets because it doesn't look solvable to me in the short run. And, it's as Kissinger famously said about Rhodesia years ago, you don't want to grab the tar baby option when you get stuck in the mess without any logical way out of it. And I think that Sudan has fallen into that now for a number of reasons, particularly our close involvement in what happened in South Sudan. We have some residual need to be seen as playing in there and doing something about it. It's kind of like in the old days, people would say, Liberia's a mess. It's the Americans' problem because they've been settled by American ex-slaves. I don't find that a valid argument, but it's politically viable, and therefore we have to pay some attention, lean on these two god-awful characters. The root of that problem is ethnic. Right. And I suspect at the end of the day, if we're going to get back in there in some effective way, we have to find some moral authority that would be persuasive. And in the case of Sudan, South Sudan, what we're left with is really the churches and the church groups. If they can persuade enough people that this is wrong and we can find some way to get both Mashar and Salva Kiir to take an option out in some way, that may be the way out, but it's not near term and it's not obvious. The danger there is, of course, having set the precedent of South Sudan, looking at the northern piece, how do you then say no to Darfur? which is ethnically separate than the rest of it, totally landlocked and otherwise kind of terror, not useful. It's hard. It's a problem I wouldn't want to get involved in, except to be aware of what's going on and look for an opportunity. But to jump in at this point, there's no point. There's none of that hurting stalemate or anything like that, or a place where outside leverage could put them at a hurling stalemate. We would have to do things to the outside allies, the Saudis and others, that we have reasons not to want to pay that particular bill to put that kind of pressure on them. We have bigger fish to fry. But we can't ignore it. It's the old, somebody's got to take the heat, send some brand name ambassador out there to solve things.
Which is kind of what happened when you were there. I mean, we have Jack Danforth. I know you worked closely with that. Was that kind of the same deal in that case? Was send a brand name ambassador and then, bring in a reasonable team that can make Sudan, whatever just geostrategic interest the United States is trying to get out of Sudan at that time, a reality? Or
well, we had a lot of leverage in Sudan that we don't anymore. I mean, literally, we had Durang's army in the south as leverage. We had a natural religious barrier between the two areas, Islam to the north, Christianity to the south. We had natural ethnic things to work with. When you try and transfer that internally now that it's loose, it doesn't work as well. But Dinka and Nuer being almost the same size, I think you have to look for secondary leaders there and, like I said, offer wonderful door prizes. And it'd probably be the Africans more than us. Certainly we want the Africans out in front of this. Whether there's an American in the closet with a long pounding pole, that'd be good to have. Sure. And somebody like Jack Danforth, personality-wise, isn't suitable in this instance. Jack Danforth was personality-wise perfect for the other situation, where you needed somebody with a diplomatic skill, which Jack had. Also of a legal bent of mind, he was a lawyer, but also actually ordained minister, which allowed him to play the religious angle better than somebody else that didn't have that credential. In the southern piece of this, you had to find you'd have to find a Rich Armitage kind of guy, the barrel-chested guy that's going to go, we're coming out of this room with a deal, or you two are not walking out. That kind of, almost put that kind of pressure on him, but have the leverage outside to back it up. And I don't see how you'd get the leverage in this case. I mean, the Africans could close their borders, their ethnic ties across the borders. It's hard to control a border in that situation. It's a tough one.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say this, and Charlie would certainly understand the dynamic better than I would, given his experience in Sudan, but it almost seems like the two sides in Sudan have to fight their way to exhaustion or stalemate, really, before there's going to be any realistic hope of a diplomatic solution or breakthrough. And we just don't seem to be there yet. I don't know if you...
Well, yeah, no, actually, not at a hurting stalemate yet. Could they get there? They could, but it'd be a bloody mess. Yeah. And you always have to knife with the long knives kind of thing.
Yeah.
I can't make a deal with Riach and his upper level, so I'm going to wipe them out, which will lead to the night of the long knives and bloodbath. But that's the kind of thing. Sure. And then there's nothing behind that. What happens when that happens? It's nothing. One wins temporarily, but a large ethnic group is alienated in the process with their associated ethnic groups. It's just not the way to solve it.
What effect do you think the Sudanese crisis is having on? There are broader boiling waters, I would say, in the region. You have Egypt, obviously, that's been at odds with Ethiopia over rights to the Nile River, and Sudan is just right there in the middle of that. You have a now escalated conflict in the Tigray region that Ethiopia is dealing with, and obviously having a massive international war happening in and around you can exacerbate some of these things, or maybe it's exactly the type of thing they need to focus on something else and allow these waters to cool. And not to mention deals between Egypt and Somalia and Egypt and Uganda to try to triangulate against the Ethiopians. What do you make of the broader regional temperature?
I mean, I think it's pretty high right now. We already talked about Sudan. You have a regime in Ethiopia, in a country which has had no shortage of inclination in the past to intervene with its neighbors, either covertly or overtly when they saw it in their interest. You have a regime now in Addis Ababa, which is more than ever agitating for access to the sea. And that runs the risk of, for example, renewed conflict with Eritrea. The Somaliland question is there because they would offer that access. And yet Somaliland cannot be fully separated, as successful as they've been, from the problems in the rest of Somalia and the CT issues that certainly continue to exist there. So, and then you have Tigray as well, which has been one of the world's lesser known but truly bloody and deadly ethnic conflicts going on, and that is far from solved. So I would say the temperature is high, and it's worth watching that situation there to anticipate and try to prevent an expansion of the all-out war that you see in Sudan.
Right. And obviously, one of the more important facets of American interest in that area is that sea line communication, is the Red Sea, the BAM, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. All of these areas that are vital to American shipping have been recently under, I think, a larger microscope, considering, what is the American interest there. But historically, it has been to control the trade routes. It's the same thing that's recognized by China. It's the same thing that's recognized by Russia in their search for warm water ports or whatever historical objective they may have. Do you think that I think one of the big ideas on the table is American recognition of Somaliland to kind of help shore up that strategic interest. Do you see that being something that could remain on the table for much longer, or something that would be the interest of the Trump administration to take potentially?
I think it's a question worth looking at. You really would have to study the longer-term second and third order effects of making a decision like that. For example, we do have a very fragile but viable CT partnership with the government in Mogadishu. We now have an embassy there. There's U.S. military presence there. It continues to operate against al-Shabaab and other terrorist organizations like ISIS, which exist in Somalia. There is a large disputed territory. People tend to forget this, between Somaliland and Puntland. Right. So, which border would we choose to recognize? Even though Puntland is not a functional state the way Somaliland is, there is disputed territory there. And then we would have to deal with how, for example, Ethiopia might react to this. There's also the possibility, and it's a little bit more academic perhaps in nature, but I think it's still worth thinking about, is as some of the other regions we've talked about, like Eastern DRC, what does it mean for the U.S., a major global power, to recognize a new sovereign state? What does that mean for the ambitions in other parts of Africa for ethnic groups or sub-states who seek the same kind of independence? I certainly have nothing but admiration for the Somalilanders for having carved out an island of stability and even some economic growth in this middle of this very unstable region. And their demands for independence have some basis in reality and some validity, but it's a question that would need to be looked at fairly carefully.
What do you make of the recent offer from Mogadishu, that kind of to get the Americans to look the other way on this issue, offering them basically full control of the port of Berbera? Do you feel like that is even something that the Americans could cash in if they accepted that? Or
I mean, it's kind of hard to see that happening, because Mogadishu simply has no say whatsoever in what happens in Somaliland. The Somalilanders, again, they are functionally independent. And what Mogadishu says or doesn't say, I don't think really matters very much to this de facto government in Somaliland.
Sure. Any thoughts?
I think it just breaks too much crockery to do it without a lot more forethought and a lot more preparation because of all the things Paul mentioned. for one thing, that it would open the door in the AU to all kinds of mini-state bidding going on, like Katanga shall be free.
Right.
That kind of stuff, As it is there's the Cameroon problem between the English speakers and the French speakers, and if you recognize them, why don't you recognize me? I'm in functional control. The only reason I'm not is the army is killing my men, women, and children. What about Biafra? We're back.
Yeah, exactly.
You'd have to say Mother May I to a whole bunch of states. And actually, in the process, you might get some input that would open your eyes to different possibilities, but you'd have to literally, as we used to call it in the old days, make the stations of the cross to find out who thought what and why. But as a stake, the Nigerians would have the stake. Well, the Sudanese have the stake because of the Darfur region. Somalia, the Kenyans, because you start playing with that card, what happens to the Northwest frontier? Sure, no longer called that, but the fist, star, and the flag of the Somalis. There's all kinds of things.
And you wonder, too, I sometimes wonder also if, as much as the Somalilanders want diplomatic recognition and feel that they've worked hard to create a stable de facto state there, if we couldn't get most of what we need without formal diplomatic recognition, to treat them, maybe this is a dumb comparison, but to treat them, perhaps a little bit like Taiwan, a country where you can have investment, you could have a trade office that functioned as an embassy in all but name. We worked with them to get access to the port facilities, bring investment there. Could we get most of what not just we need, but what the Somalilanders need and want also, without taking that final step of diplomatic recognition?
Couldn't you argue that there have been decisions that were made by Trump 1 that have those vestiges? For example, Western Sahara. And, the can of worms that was opened was the Trump administration just said no to all the other people who vied for that option as well. Why is it more complicated than just telling any other state like Biafra or any of these other groups no?
Because some of these countries are capable of causing a lot of problems. I'm not saying this is likely to happen, but let me give you a scenario. And Charlie, I welcome your thoughts on this too. Say we decide to recognize Somaliland, and then say M23, with the diplomatic and military backing of Rwanda, says, well, listen, it's been decades since Kinshasa has exerted any control on this region, which is ethnically, geographically, a continent apart from Kinshasa. So why not just call it what it is, an independent state that deserves and demands recognition from the rest of the world. And by the way, when we get that, we welcome your investment for all the riches that we have. Would we risk opening the door to that kind of a conversation if we recognize Somaliland? It's a bit of an academic argument, a thought experiment, if you will, but I still think it's something worth considering before we take that step.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's the door you don't want to open without a lot more forethought, and etc. I mean, your Taiwan idea is an interesting take on that problem. It certainly helps stabilize an area you want stabilized without crossing the line of recognition. And the argument back to the Somalis were, if you finally get a better handle on the military situation, you could be Somaliland and we might be able to solve this.
Right.
But for now, you don't have that option, so you have to be careful. Baby steps are always dangerous because somebody always interprets it being a middle-aged child as opposed to a baby step, and then says, why not me? And then you get that whole pattern anyway, even though you've not done a sovereign recognition, you've done something less.
Right.
It's a tough one. And then you got part of the base right problems. Do we need the bases exposed as that? Djibouti's about as exposed as I want to get going towards the Red Sea. That's why God made boats and aircraft carriers. You can move them around.
Right.
If you put Berber in place, any terrorist worth his salt would be busy trying to figure out, how can I cause the Americans trouble here? Sure, anybody else, the European Union, anybody who took that thing on. And Lord knows there's enough Chinese short-range missiles that could be purchased on the market, hidden from a number of places.
It brings up I think an even more poignant conversation in some respects, which is what are we going to do about basing in Africa? I mean, the conversation for a long time has been maybe AFRICOM moves south. Maybe it moves onto the African continent. Maybe it moves back to the continent of the United States. But now does AFRICOM exist altogether? What do you make of that argument?
Well, as you know, I thought AFRICOM was a bad idea to begin with, but now that it exists, it has its uses, and in fact, changing it would be a decision of some weight too. And I would argue that we need to keep it. Do we need to push it back under the European command? I don't know the ins and outs of that, so I would think not once you separated it, because then are you treating it as subordinate to a European problem? And that's always been the problem with that. It was always the deputy commander from EUCOM that did AFRIPAS, and AFRICOM for the first time said there's an African commander in the United States, that's what his focus is, that's what his problem is. I would argue if you're going to pull it back, on the other hand, that you pull it all the way back. Pull it back to the States and make it something different. We used to handle Africa out of the southern United States. There's a couple of bases that some local populations would love to see reoccupied. And yes, you could operate out of that effectively, special spectral operations, that kind of stuff, which is mostly what we have.
Right.
Whereas if you actually put a base in Africa, it's hard to see that happening in terms of stability anywhere. And then you're talking about wives and families and that kind of stuff. And first, they'd have to welcome us until they welcome their potential terrorist threat that goes with it, because you submit as a target. You could find a safe enough neighborhood, but that's a lot of money, and this administration doesn't seem to want to spend money on that kind of thing. And if it's pullback, why Europe? Why not the United States?
Right.
But in principle, I think it should continue to exist, because it says that Africa matters to us at a relatively inexpensive price, because we got to operate against the threat anyway.
It feels like, I think we all understand the growing geostrategic importance of Africa, that if we're going to continue to use a combatant command system, then the more Africa and the population grows, the more trade interests grow on the African continent, the more those trade routes are important to us, which again is tracing by itself back to original American strategy inherited from the British. Then an Africa command makes sense, and possibly eventually even moving on to the African continent. We now have Kenya as a major non-NATO ally, and for all the reasons you outlined, like those are perfectly applicable to the Kenyans. But do you think that there's an argument to be made that it would be prudent to do it now, or at least in the near term, to get the ball rolling? I guess would be one of the stronger arguments. Or do you think that it, again, is I think I know your answer is going to be we'll wait and see. But do you think there's even any worth in toying with that idea?
Yeah, I think that the wait is exactly what I do, because just turn around and tell it at the Pentagon study days.
Yeah, fair enough.
Take up some time. And who knows, I should come up with a good idea in the process, but it buys you time if you're having to make this decision. And I think it would be self-inflicted wound to make this decision front and center anyway.
Sure.
Sure. The talking heads like us bring it up, but that doesn't mean the management is serious about it.
Right.
Not in the current circumstances. Doesn't rise to that level. On the other hand, if you're looking for bases in Africa, the logical place to have gone years ago would have been South Africa. That would have worked out badly, as it turns out.
Sure.
For political reasons.
Sure. Before we actually talk about South Africa, there is a model that has been used. The Chinese are using the basing model. They only really have one formal military base, and that's in Djibouti down the street from ours. But they do this in tandem a lot of time with exclusive economic zones, where they are developing the hard infrastructure that allows them to control all the same things that we want to control if we are consistent with original American strategy. Do you think that there would be any merit to mirroring them and the successes they've had there? Or, again, just wait and see?
With the economic zones?
Sure.
Yeah. I don't know. I just don't know. I'm not conversant enough on how those works, for example, with the Chinese in Africa, how much value they brought to the African countries where they're located. So I couldn't say.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
We'll put a footnote there.
The secret sub base is libido.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or, we'll see. Not so secret. Make it, Walt Disney World, Angola, and
There you go. Oh, hide under the French banner, Ashton Earl.
yes. Back to South Africa. Obviously, current political climate there wouldn't have been a good idea. What do we make of developments there? Is this just been a long time coming, or is this as abrupt as some people are making it out to be?
Putting my political scientist hat on, which I hate to do, that doesn't fit comfortably. I think the truth is that South Africa never developed from a revolutionary party. And that's what we're seeing. They haven't had the actual independence that they thought they had. And now we're starting to see that. And the parties are emerging and so on. But will the dominant party allow a free and fair fight? The same question you have everywhere else in Africa. And that's the question. Is it going to go the right way or not? And I don't follow the internal politics closely enough. Clearly, they have major economic problems, which is what really underlies this political instability. When you look at Africa, the sky is still dark, and it's dark in South Africa except right around Cape Town. So that means that the revolution that the ANC promised, and then Mandela thought he had launched in terms of his own time in office, didn't happen. The villages aren't electrified, the roads aren't so good, the schools aren't so good, etc. And yet there's enough wealth there. That's it. Is it a corruption problem? Certainly there's a lot of the free press that they have who say there's a big corruption problem. But I don't know enough about the details to be sure of that. But I think it's still at the point where it hasn't gone over the edge yet. So there's a chance that the South Africans themselves can pull it back. But it will take them getting past the classic independence thing and respecting the parties of God, for all practical purposes, the Cape Town party and the rest, which is really 2 or 3 major parties behind figureheads like Ronald Post and somebody else. Is there a next generation leader? There may be, but we may not know who he is or she is for that matter. So I'm not optimistic in the near term, but they have the wealth. But when you see things like mines being closed around Johannesburg and the old major hotel that everybody used to stay in there being totally unsafe, it's just something wrong has happened, and it shouldn't have. Can the police services be restored? Sure, they could be, but it would take somebody of a mind to be a security-minded guy without being a coup-minded guy.
Sure.
And I don't see that person, but then like I said, I don't follow the details. And to have that kind of ability to predict, you'd have to have the granularity of, if a political officer been stationed there for a second time now and know the personalities and saw they changed over 3 years.
Right.
A lot more argument for continuity here.
Right. The coup thing would be an interesting element. I mean, the South Africans they pride themselves, right, on we just held a peaceful transfer of power. It's a government of national unity, but it's still, I think for most observers, a little bit ambiguous as to how unified that national government is, and how different it really is from pure ANC rule. And that obviously throws another wrench in the equation. Paul, anything that you disagree with or
No,
is worth elaborating on?
and I think Charlie's comment about the ANC still struggling to emerge from its revolutionary exile mentality, even 30 years later, there's still a lot of truth to that. I mean, all of the leaders, including the present one, are old enough that they still have ties back to that world. And I think especially since the death of Mandela, they have struggled to emerge from that. There are some positive things for sure: a robust free press, a strong economy, elections which have come off on time and have generally been considered free and fair. If they weren't free and fair, I don't think the ANC would have won only 40% of the vote in the last election. But it is stuck in a highly corrupt, sclerotic political environment. I would hope that the next generation of ANC leaders, whoever that might be, may bring some new thinking there. I also think this will get me banned forever from South Africa, but I think that there's a strong sense of unjustified arrogance in the ANC that has also hindered development in South Africa, and it ties back to their having been the party that overthrew or that took over after apartheid. It has to do with Mandela's legacy, but I think it's infused the ANC with kind of an overconfidence that has been harmful to the country.
Right. One of the interesting aspects of this, and where it matters especially to the United States, is there does seem to be some degree of ideological component to how South Africa is navigating the global landscape. They're obviously using their whatever influence they have at the UN to conduct lawfare against Israel, which is a residual issue stemming from before the ANC was in power, but is materializing now. And also, they have moved eastward in the way where they look for international collaboration, conducting naval drills with the Russians and the Chinese, helping establish some degree of control over that sea line of communication, which has mattered quite a bit since the Red Sea has been closed off. What do you make of that? And do you think these things really they merit the degree of a response the United States has provided them in the last few months?
I mean, I don't think they've moved east. I think they've always been east.
Okay.
They emerged from that environment when they were an exile movement and were strongly supported by the Eastern Bloc. The South African Communist Party is one of the oldest parties in the world, and while it sounds quaint to talk about communism today, that kind of thinking still exists and still is still a factor, I think, in South Africa. I think a big part of the reason, if not the major reason, the ANC lost so heavily in the last vote was that the mass of South Africans just really don't care about taking Israel to the ICJ or the new program for African development or mediating the conflict in the Congo. As noble as those objectives might be, it's really not addressing the day-to-day needs of South Africans who are suffering rolling blackouts, potholed streets, the world's worst inequality by most measures. These are the things that the people of South Africa quite understandably care about the most.
Why? This has been in American news quite a bit, and I think that a lot of Americans, aside from being, I think, as a lot of these developments are brought to their attention, like changing this name of the street that the U.S. Embassy is on to the name of a Palestinian terrorist, so that they have to write it on envelopes every time they sign the mail. Things like that are infuriating to Americans.
Yeah.
But why do you think they matter to the point where the Trump administration has made some of these moves against the South Africans?
Well, I think because these are, what's the phrase I'm looking for? This is gesture politics by the South Africans, which in previous administrations, Washington might see just as gestures. But this administration is itself, in some ways, a gesture politics administration. And so taking an approach where we're going to deliberately poke our finger in the eye of the Trump administration, I don't think he's inclined really to look the other way on insults like that, the way some previous administrations might have. And that's why I think you see, or it's a reasonable explanation, that's why you see this stronger reaction on the part of this administration to some of the things that South Africa has done.
Makes sense. Or Snyder?
Well, I think that it's also part of this movement to empower the BRICS and these other kind of emerging outside entities. But the BRICS is a kind of a fragile operation. In practice, South Africans are in it. Makes it appear that way more than most. But I think that's their driving idea. And the trouble is that if they mean to be the reinforcing African entity for this movement, they need to have gotten something out of it. And they haven't done the basic politics. Like, I would want a prize for my being such an exciting member of the BRICS. How about some help with my power problems? What about a series of small nuclear plants? Because that's the quickest way to get the power on the ground if I don't have idiotic regulation. Or what about solving the Gecko-mines subsidy problem? There was a giant water project that they were trying to do as a goodwill gesture, the English Harbour project. They literally could light the lights up all the way over southern Africa. And this was done by reasonable scientists. That's actually a possibility. Transmission lines and other things being a nightmare to protect. Why didn't you try and get some kind of gesture from that? I think that goes to the issue of a failure to mature politically. They're still, I'm enjoying this as the revolution.
Right.
This is different, but what do I get for it? There's a missing transactional piece. And I think maybe that's something they're going to find out if they poke their finger in the Trump administration's eye. This is a transactional outfit, and you don't really want to do that unless you got something for it,
Right.
more than a headline.
Last question on South Africans, and unless another one comes, is you mentioned earlier this transition of the leadership of the ANC into potentially younger groups. This is a trend that we're seeing across the board in a lot of African states where the revolutionary parties are getting old. And traditionally, it's been, unless you were there in Montgomery, Alabama with me, you're not getting a spot at the table. And it has been that way for many African revolutionary parties. Do you suspect that transition of power will succeed, and that the ANC will continue to, after it passes on that torch in whatever shape that passage comes, will it continue to be as powerful as it has been? Or do you think that this could spell the start of the demise for groups like the ANC or SWAPO in Namibia, where their current president she was very, very young. She just got elected, but again, they still adhere to this rule of you have to have been there, but they're running out of those options.
No, and I think it'll be a sign of maturity when we see them move away from that. And I think that, time inevitably we're forced them to move away from it. But some of them are going to do it quicker than others. And there may be a case, as a good one point, it's stable all along. It has enough economic viability. One of the telling factors, I think, in the Namibian possibility was the number of Afrikaners who decided to transition, not in the Republic, but in Namibia, so that the technical people that are running the police and some other things, and they're getting old too, but they're going to naturally transition out, but they stayed long enough to pass on skills. And that same idea the ANC needs to get with, saying, okay, we've done this miracle thing, but now we need to be serious about building the infrastructure out. And that's going to take the expertise that we already have. We just need to use it. We can't let party lines define it. And we need to almost a truly federalized bureaucracy. They don't have that now. Right. And I think something like that may be part of the solution for them. Although you've always got the man on the white horse, and you never know where they're going to come from. Could be the military, could not be the military. The thing that'll change it all is the technology is changing it all. Like the Africans could jump several development steps because you can pay your bills on the cell phone now. The cell phones are all over Africa now. The news is all over Africa now. That one technological development has changed things. And I think the first one in South Africa that figures out how to use that and mobilize that becomes the TikTok killer in South Africa.
Sure.
Could very well transition the whole thing. And it could be the ANC. Could be one of the younger members of the ANC that does that.
Right.
It can help them jump forward. But again, you want to extract something from the bricks. Well, you've got some of that technology. And what about this technology? How about I want that as part of my political settlement?
Right. It's a good point. I hadn't thought about that point. Anything you want to add to that point?
No, I would just say that I think that transition is already underway in South Africa. I mean, when the ANC fell below 50%, it's the clearest sign that you could ask for that we're entering kind of the post-apartheid era, if you will, in South Africa, and we'll see what comes. There are some troubling political trends in the wings in South Africa. Some of these parties that pose the greatest threat to the ANC's dominance are extreme leftist, statist parties that, have little time or sympathy for, the development of capitalist economy and so forth. And that could spell trouble for South Africa. But that chapter has yet to be written, I would say.
Okay, that makes sense. we'll move from South Africa, and there's one more region that I think from your class, we have to talk about, is you can't have an African policy without a Nigeria policy. There have been some pretty significant shifts in power there. ECOWAS now has a competitor in the AES, coming from this new coalition of Sahelian states. How do you see the United States being able to navigate relations with the Nigerians specifically? I guess we should ask broadly about multilateral institutions on the African continent, like ECOWAS, like the AES, like the African Union, which is becoming a much more prevalent group than perhaps it was just a few years ago. So we'll start with Nigeria and then maybe talk about multilateral engagement with some other African states.
Well, I think if the Trump administration really does mean to pursue this policy of economic growth and what's in it for me, critical minerals, etc., then the Nigerians are at the center of that in many ways, being a multi-ethnic state in many ways, major oil, etc., but also disastrously compounded by a failure to be truly uncorrupt, etc. And there's a tension there, but I think that's where I would argue we should put a major emphasis on this. Yes, we should go for critical minerals, but we should also go for the bigger, where's the American opportunity for other things? The Nigerians could be the ones that could build the Chinese cars, etc., that kind of thing, and we could have a stake in that. Not in China, but somewhere else. We could create a competitor. Toyota builds in the United States. So wasn't we, as an investment, together with the Nigerian and sovereign fund or something, begin to get some auto plants and that kind of thing. Something more sophisticated than we've been willing to do elsewhere, but have it led by the investment community. When, this special envoy comes out of Nigeria and did business there.
Right.
If he's looking for a second job after he picks the cotton gold, clearly this can lead the charge for the economic change in Nigeria. And this great African population growth, this explosion to 30% of the world population. Well, guess what? Nigeria is already there in terms of Africa.
Right.
What's the number? Somewhere like 1 in 4 Africans is Nigerian. That number will, if not stay in that range, be close. And you can't have an Africa policy without them. And they're more than willing to work with us, which you don't get everywhere. Do we have a great history with them? No. Do they have a great history with us? No. But the possibilities are there, and that's where I'd go with it. The banking system kind of works. You could use it for investment. And I'd look at the regional entities in that same context. If you're looking for security for these critical minerals developments and critical infrastructure, once the railroad crosses my boundary, who's responsible for protecting it? It's got to go all the way to the coast. Looking at the sub-regional entities as a thing in which you can put your security basket, if you will, to protect some of these mineral interests. Not that you supply the weapons, or even the professional military company to do it, but that as part of your strategy, if you're going to pursue this financial investment strategy, you need to consider all that in a regional entity that you're now pairing with maybe our banking operation back here. Granted, there's I don't know, make him a vice president, give him a nice title. And he's the one responsible for this entity, which is now the Nigerian, I'll call them economic zones if you want.
Yeah.
West African something zone, and there's another one just above it and so on. And target the investment structure that makes sense there. Some places it'll be critical minerals, some places it'll be somewhere else. But we saw that in the first Trump administration. You got Prosper Africa, and so far, Project 2025 is well close. They're headed that way again. Why not make it something that'll survive the administration by having an African route now? Some of these entities are used to dealing with an American counterpart that's like this. That's not necessarily the State Department. It's a foreign investment entity that does that kind of thing. And it also lessens the complication of the politics of it.
Right. Nigeria, I think, is a important piece in the broader question of how mutually exclusive are American and Chinese investment in one state. I think it's fair to say that the Viktor Orban analogy of the, two sons don't get too close to either, exists in most African states' minds. Is that why do we have to pick a side? And I don't think anybody here is trying to, nobody in the Trump administration right now, I think, is arguing that you have to pick a side completely at this point. But that conversation is probably going to come for a lot of these people in Nigeria, who has a like you said, a long history of working with the Americans. They're also the front page of a lot of African or Chinese investments in Africa. Those exclusive economic zones we were talking about. Lekki, just south of Lagos, is the hallmark project for the Chinese there. It's right next to Mr. Dangote's oil refinery. Can these things exist at the same time as these American involvements that you just talked about?
I think if you take the view that the opportunities are as malice as your imagination, that it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. And I would argue because Africa is so new, and that's in terms of the world economic picture, and has the growing population, and so many basic things laying around to be done that can be done financially successfully. Critical minerals, the oil, if it was done right, the wastage that goes on and the leakage in the pipelines, the environment, all that crap that happens in the environment, could all be fixed by an adult company given responsibility, but also the financial payoff for doing that kind of thing. That all of that is there, and you could look at that. The same thing with the fishing industry. That the Chinese are busy looting with their fishing boats, everything. A natural counter to that is not to go at them with more boats. Let's supply the Africans with 10,000 more boats, but supply them with the ability to process the fish on shore, and supply them with the intelligence about where this is moving, and then supply them with the one or two small patrol boats, or let them buy them with the process, right? And start to put a dent in that, and then have the Chinese realize that they can exploit that. They could put the ship in there and have them process it. The ship can't fish back, then there could be a synergy in this. So I think the two suns analogy is not necessarily a good one. There can be one big sun for all of us, but we got to get in there. Sure. And I think if you tie too much to one country, like Nigeria, there's a chance something could go south. You could get your favorite anti-American in charge, or from the Chinese point of view, get your favorite anti-Chinese guy in charge. And both of us can survive as an entity like this. And if our purpose is really compete economically, not militarily, we can do that. Now, somebody's got to do the security for all this. So there'll be a piece of that. Sure. But that's not I would say more power to the lowest bidder, and more power to he who's willing to put boots on the ground to do it. Training boots, right? Not serious boots, unless you're renting them until you get the army standing up. But I see the Nigerians as being the potential key to that, just because the infrastructure is kind of there. And you got a lot of African countries that don't have the infrastructure in terms of the institutions and things. I mean, they're corrupt, the backdoor people don't exist and getting paid. Yeah, but that probably happened in the United States in the roaring 20s and the 1800s in a big way. And you got past it. I think we can get past it. And the Chinese are as good at us as ferreting that out. They survived in Africa long enough. So, but Nigeria can't ignore it. That's, like I said, can't have an Africa policy without a Nigeria policy. Right. But I'd stay economic. I wouldn't want to be the one trying to solve the Boko Haram problem. Right. It's a complicated political and religious problem and ethnic. Sure.
Right. Any other thoughts, Paul?
No, but I think African countries, most of them anyway, are interested in a diversified set of international partners, economic and political. There are things that America does better than China. We've talked about some of them today, like CT assistance and so forth. And we should remember, too, that China is not economically invulnerable. It may seem like a long ways away right now, but Africa would be vulnerable to an economic shock or downturn in China, given how heavily they've invested in the continent. And I'm sure that African countries are not unaware of that possibility, as distant as it may seem. The idea you talked briefly about regional organizations. It's an interesting one. I think there have been instances when they've worked, such as ECOWAS in Liberia. One of the big recent successes, I think, was the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM, which was critical in stabilizing the situation in Mogadishu as that transitional government got underway. But it's also certainly not a panacea. I think the creation of the AES in the Sahel, in some ways, is an expression of ECOWAS's failure as these Sahelian countries took themselves out of that organization.
Right. I think that's a fairly good overview of the general threat/interest environment in Africa. And so I think probably the last topic we should talk about for this podcast is what in the world can the United States do about these things? And I think that one of the big topics that comes to mind really is the battle for the narrative. It's if you look at polls, Pew Research did a recent poll asking, Africans, who do you want to work with? And it is not exactly one way or another, but it is both the United States and China and other groups are fairly, depending on the group that they talk to, there are some different representations there. And considering the history of U.S. involvement in Africa, you would think that we would be able to fight for the narrative much better than we currently do. Algeria, for example, JFK was one of the Revolutionary Party's greatest allies as far as the narrative is concerned. We talked about Namibia earlier, where there was extensive negotiations the United States led that resulted in part in Namibian independence. And however, Namibia is not exactly in America's zone at this point. They take much more from the Chinese, and they tend to politically gravitate further towards them. At least their new president has. He's the one who led the effort for them to become part of the Belt and Road Initiative over the last decade. Why does the United States have such a hard time advancing a positive narrative on the African continent?
I think some of it might be rooted a little bit in history. Somehow, in the years after the wave of independence swept across Africa in the early 1960s and on in the Cold War, America did get tagged with this neo-colonial label, which honestly, I just don't think fits at all. We were never a colonial power in Africa. In many cases, the United States agitated effectively for independence for African countries. Some of it, I think, had to do with effective active measures programs by the USSR to tag us with that. But even to this day, some obviously pro-African policies like AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, were tagged by some on the left as some kind of neo-colonialist plot. So it's still sometimes a bit of a struggle for the United States, I think, to emerge from that shadow. I think one thing that would help, perhaps more than anything else, to get back to something we talked about at the very beginning here, and that is to develop a real level of expertise and a cadre of experts in Africa, in the diplomatic sphere, public diplomacy, development and humanitarian assistance, security. I think that would go an awful long way to help us recapture the narrative in Africa. Focusing on what the Africans want and need most from us also. It's a very simple step to take, but I think we've occasionally in some places lost that thread and pursued more of our own hobby horses rather than what was important to the Africans would help in that regard. Those are just a couple of thoughts that come to my mind.
Yeah, I think part of it is we do have to get in the, not necessarily the propaganda game, that's a negative connotation of that, but we have to get in the American story game more than we are. And I think that's just by making people available to do the 60 Minutes and that kind of thing, commentary on why Africa's, 10 minutes from this is the new plan for Africa, blah, 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 give you an exclusivity on this. Be more attuned to using our own media to deliver a message overseas in Africa and other places. And their counterparts, Al Jazeera and those kind of. Al Jazeera would give you 5 minutes talking about anything pretty much, provided he has some credibility on the subject. And the same thing with literally looking for African media the South African newspapers, etc., would love to have an American column written by name brand Americans that talk about different things, culture, whatever. But that kind of approach to it, where there's a presence in their existing media, whereas the idea that we're bombarding them with state propaganda as part of a war. This is more kind of we want to do more business here. We don't seem to understand each other, and so we're doing these kind of things to reach out. Sure. And feel free to, fire the question off on the internet to this guy or gal that just appeared here, the next 2 weeks he'll answer questions.
Right.
Some approach like that, it's more almost minute in its approach than sure. Because I think there's too many individual markets. Everybody forgets Africa's 54 countries. Yeah. Because we got this bad habit of saying Africa. And then we develop an Africa policy. And I guess generically we have an Asia policy, but do we?
I think also I would add too that sometimes, sitting here in Washington, it's easy to think that somehow we're losing the narrative in Africa. I don't think that's necessarily the case when you're there. My experience, I admit, is a little bit dated, but from having worked in Central Africa and East Africa over the past couple of decades, the American brand was actually pretty healthy in the places I worked. So it would be a mistake, I think, just to look at the statistics, Chinese investment,
right,
number of embassies and so forth, and just assume automatically somehow we're losing the narrative battle.
How do you convince Americans of that? Because you go to the Hill, you go into any of these agencies, and you ask people who are running these places, what is Africa worth it? That's just a Chinese enclave. We've already lost that battle. Move on and we'll win somewhere else.
It's tough because Africa doesn't have a large constituency politically here in Washington. I would say one thing that works really well, if you're in the State Department or in AFRICOM or in some area, is to get people from the Hill or businessmen or people of influence to actually visit the continent. Most people find it an eye-opening and rewarding experience. And giving a little bit of direct exposure to this somewhat mysterious part of the world is almost always pays dividends. And it generates a lasting interest in Africa and African affairs when you can do that.
Makes sense. Do you have any thoughts on that specifically? Or I think what I want to do is open it up for any last just complete. It doesn't have to necessarily apply to any of the questions we just said, but if you had a wish list item the United States could do right now and the Trump administration could develop this capability, what would that be and why would you recommend that? And then anything that you think we left out during the last few hours?
I would say going from where we are now, where certainly the image inside the United States, and therefore I assume outside the United States, is that this is a administration that's shrinking, smashing, making things smaller, and not to flip it on its head, but to be more tangible and to say this new, like the Development Finance Administration, whatever name we're calling it these days is, that there's now a number. We're finished this Dodge process, and then there's now a number, and this is what you intend to invest in Africa. And what we're after is critical minerals, this and that. And then look at some other areas like that. We're interested in more security in Africa because we can't do this investment. And there's still going to be the IMED list some of the programs that are going to survive. And the smaller State Department will be more effective because we're going to be more expert and blah, blah, blah. And yes, we're having to pull back, but where do you think we're getting? In other words, a narrative that says, this is what the changes we just did means for you, as opposed to this slash and burn. And, I think they have to flip it on its head. And they don't necessarily have to do it now. They're clearly not finished with this. It's only been 2 months. Right. But they need to pick a point, maybe at the naming of the assistant secretary, sure, to lay that out. Or an assistant secretary of the Treasury for international development. Or pick some target like that and have them lay it out and change the message out there. For one thing, it'll dominate a couple of days of news, especially if you put a full digs at the Chinese and maybe the Russians in. Couldn't hurt.
Just for fun.
That's right. And welcome our new partners like Qataris and make it more interesting let it get picked up. That'd be the argument I'd make if I was playing their game, given what I think they intend to do.
Makes sense.
I would agree with Charlie. I think that as long as America remains a global power, and I don't see that changing, Africa will be a part of it. And it doesn't take a huge amount of investment in Africa to make a big difference. To invest in that expertise and that knowledge, and having leadership in the State Department and NSC and other places with Africa experience, it's actually much less costly than one might think, and yet you get a big return on your investment in a place like Africa, and you can do that. These are small embassies, modest programs, and yet, as Chester Crocker once said, it's a place where you can do diplomacy or security or development for its own sake, usually unencumbered by larger political wins, and it can make a difference.
Well, just want to thank Professor Kepp and Dr. Snyder for joining us here today to talk pretty much all things Africa. I think we talked about we could keep going if we wanted to, but for the sake of everybody else who doesn't necessarily want to listen to things about Africa, I think we'll stop here. But if you guys are more interested in topics of this nature, feel free to visit us at iwp.edu. Again, we're a graduate school. We focus on things of this nature and advancing the tools of statecraft forward in the interest of the United States and allied nations. So with that, I think we'll close.
Thank you.
If you like our podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe. And if you are interested in learning more about the topics we covered here today and want to be a student at IWP, go to iwp.edu and click Apply Now.